The morning of March 14th, 1944, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Müller stood in the conning tower of U-554, watching the grey waters of the North Atlantic roll past his pressure hull. The U-boat was running submerged at periscope depth, 60 feet below the surface. Diesel engines silent, electric motors pushing them through the water at 4 knots. Above them, somewhere in the fog and spray, a British convoy was passing. 40 merchant ships, maybe more. Targets. Müller had been hunting convoys for 18 months, 23 patrols, 11 confirmed kills. He knew the rhythm of the hunt, the patient stalking, the careful maneuvering into attack position. But something had changed in the past 2 months. Something the Kriegsmarine briefings didn't explain and the intelligence officers couldn't identify. U-boats were disappearing. Not in the violent, explosive way they died when torpedoes found them or depth charges crushed their hulls. They were simply vanishing. One moment, a boat would report contact with an escort vessel. The next moment, silence. No distress calls, no wreckage. Just gone. U-554's hydrophone operator, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. He'd been listening to the convoy's propeller noise for 20 minutes, counting screws, identifying ship types, 40 merchant vessels, 8 escorts, standard convoy configuration. But Hoffmann was listening for something else, a specific sound, a sound that other U-boat operators had described in their final transmissions before going silent. A sound like rain hitting water, but metallic, sharp, staccato. The British called it Hedgehog. The German submariners had begun calling it Totenbringer, Deathbringer. Nobody knew exactly what it was. British intelligence had mentioned a new forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon in late 1942, but the initial reports were dismissive. Success rates of 5%. Better than conventional depth charges. Most U-boat commanders ignored it. If the weapon fired ahead of the attacking ship, they reasoned, standard evasive maneuvers would work. Go deep, change course, wait for the depth charges to stop exploding, surface when the escorts moved on. Except the escorts weren't moving on anymore, and the depth charges weren't exploding. U-boats that encountered this new weapon simply stopped transmitting. By March 1944, 18 boats had vanished in the North Atlantic, in circumstances that suggested hedgehog attacks. 18 crews, nearly 900 men, all gone without explanation. Müller didn't believe in ghosts, he believed in physics, steel, water pressure, explosive force. Whatever this weapon was, it followed the same laws of nature as everything else. It could be understood, it could be defeated. He just needed to see it first. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem wasn't just the weapon. It was the silence. Depth charges were loud, deafening. When a destroyer dropped a pattern of depth charges, every man on the U-boat heard them exploding. The hull rang like a bell. Lights flickered. Gauges jumped. Even if the charges missed by 100 meters, the pressure waves shook the boat hard enough to terrify the crew. But that noise was information. It told you where the charges were landing, if they were getting closer or farther away, whether you needed to go deeper or change course. The explosions gave you data to work with. Hedgehog didn't explode unless it hit something. If the attack missed, there was just silence. No booming concussions, no pressure waves. Just the quiet hum of your electric motors and the sound of your own breathing. That silence was worse than the explosions, because it meant the escort ship above you still had sonar contact. It meant they were reloading, repositioning, preparing another attack. And you had no way to know if the next salvo would land on your hull or miss by meters. The hydrophone operator's voice cut through Müller's thoughts. Contact bearing 030, range approximately 800 meters. Propeller count, twin screws, destroyer class. Through the murk and spray, he could see a shape. HMS Starling, British corvette. Flower class. He recognized the silhouette. Starling had been hunting this convoy route for weeks. She'd sunk U-624 in February, U-709 2 weeks ago. Both times, survivors reported the same thing. No warning, no depth charge pattern. Just a sound like metal rain hitting the water, then nothing. Müller made his decision. Take us down. 150 meters, silent running. The diving officer acknowledged. The boat angled downward, planes adjusted, ballast flooded. The deck tilted beneath their feet. 100 meters. 120. 150. They leveled off in the black water, suspended in the Atlantic's cold darkness. Müller ordered all non-essential systems shut down. The crew moved in slow motion, conserving oxygen, making no noise. This was the drill. Go deep. Go silent. Wait for the escort to lose contact and move on. Except Starling didn't lose contact. Through the hull, Müller could hear the destroyer's ASDIC pinging. Active sonar. The British were holding them. The pings came in steady intervals, each one a hammer blow against the pressure hull. Ping. Pause. Ping. Pause. Starling knew exactly where they were. Then Hoffman's voice, tight with fear. Herr Kalliun, I'm hearing something. Multiple splashes. Forward of our position. Range, maybe 200 meters. Müller felt his stomach clench. This was it, the sound other commanders had described, the sound that came before the silence. How many splashes? I count 24, Herr Kalliun, all hitting the water within 8 seconds of each other. 24 projectiles. Müller did the math instantly. If they were spaced 15 feet apart, that created a circular pattern about 40 meters in diameter. His boat was 76 meters long. If that pattern landed anywhere near them, they were inside the kill zone. The projectiles were sinking fast. Hoffman reported hearing them descending. Müller ordered a course change, hard to starboard, full ahead on electric motors. The boat responded sluggishly at depth. Turning radius at 150 meters was over 100 meters. They needed 30 seconds to complete the turn. The projectiles would reach them in under 10 seconds. The hydrophone operator counted down. Projectiles passing through 100 meters. 120. 140. They were sinking at 23 feet per second, faster than any depth charge. No time to evade, no time to surface. No time to do anything but wait and hope the pattern missed. 150 meters. Hoffman's voice went silent. The entire crew held their breath. Müller gripped the periscope housing, knuckles white, waiting for the impact. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Nothing. The projectiles had missed. They'd passed through the U-boat's depth and continued sinking toward the ocean floor without detonating. Müller felt his heartbeat slow. They'd survived. The crew began to breathe again. Some men made the sign of the cross. Others simply stared at the deck plates, processing what had just happened. But Starling hadn't finished. The ASDIC pings continued. The British still had contact, and Müller knew what came next. Another pattern. Another 24 projectiles. The escorts could reload in 3 minutes. All they had to do was maintain sonar contact and fire again, and again, and again, until one pattern landed on top of them. The problem for U-boat commanders was simple. You couldn't dodge what you couldn't hear exploding. Depth charges gave. Warning. Their explosions told you if the attack was getting closer. With Hedgehog, there was no warning. Just the sound of projectiles entering the water, then silence. Either they missed and you lived, or they hit and you died. There was no middle ground. No near misses that scared the crew but left the boat intact. 1 or 2 direct hits were sufficient to punch through the pressure hull, and once the hull was breached at depth, there was no escape. Müller ordered another course change, this time to port, full speed, zigzag pattern. It was the only tactic he had. Keep moving. Make yourself a harder target. Hope the British couldn't predict your maneuvers. But that required battery power, lots of it. And U-554's batteries were already at 60%. Running full speed at depth drained them at 4% per hour. They had maybe 12 hours of power left before they'd need to surface and recharge. Starling could hunt them for days. The second pattern hit the water. 8 minutes later, another 24 projectiles. Hoffman counted them. Again, they descended at terrifying speed. Again, Müller ordered evasive maneuvers. This time the pattern landed closer, maybe 50 meters off the starboard beam, but 50 meters was still a miss. The projectiles continued to the bottom without detonating. The crew's relief was palpable. 2 attacks survived, but how many more would come? What Müller didn't understand was the mathematics of the weapon. Each Hedgehog bomb was 7 inches in diameter, 65 pounds, carrying 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. Torpex was 40% more powerful than TNT. A single hit on the pressure hull would create a hole 3 to 4 inches wide. At 150 meters depth, water pressure was over 200 pounds per square inch. That hole would flood the boat with 400 gallons per minute, enough to raise the internal atmospheric pressure and temperature to lethal levels within minutes. Enough to send the boat sinking beyond crush depth before anyone could react. But Müller didn't know any of this. The Kriegsmarine intelligence briefings had been vague. The weapon was described as experimental, unproven, ineffective. Success rates were low. U-boats had survived encounters with it. That's what the reports said. What the reports didn't say was that those early encounters had occurred in late 1942 and early 1943, when British crews were still learning to use the weapon, when confidence was low and training was inadequate, when success rates were barely 5%. By March 1944, everything had changed. British crews had been trained properly, confidence had been restored. Sonar operators had learned to maintain contact during Hedgehog attacks. Fire control systems had been integrated with ASDIC targeting. The weapon that had been a failure in 1942 had become the most effective anti-submarine weapon in the Atlantic by 1944. And the success rate had climbed from 5% to nearly 20%. 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks now resulted in a kill. For U-boat crews, those were terrible odds. A single convoy crossing might involve 3 or 4 Hedgehog attacks. 20% chance per attack meant a crew had maybe a 50-50 chance of surviving a single convoy encounter. Over multiple patrols, the odds became statistical certainty. Eventually, the weapon would get you. It was just a matter of time. Starling fired a third pattern at 0945 hours. This one landed even closer. Hoffman reported splashes 20 meters off the port bow, close enough that Müller could hear them hitting the water through the hull. The projectiles descended like falling hammers. Müller braced for impact, but again, the pattern missed. The bombs sank past them without detonating. 3 attacks survived. Müller's crew was exhausted. Fear did that. It drained men faster than physical labor. Some of them were shaking. Others had stopped reacting at all, sitting at their stations with blank faces, waiting for death. The 4th attack came at 10:15, another 24 projectiles. This time, Starling had adjusted her aim. The pattern landed directly overhead. Hoffman's voice was barely a whisper. Projectiles descending, Herr Kaleon, directly above us. Müller didn't order evasive maneuvers. There was no time. The projectiles would reach them in 8 seconds. At that range, any turn would take too long. All he could do was stand in the conning tower and wait. The first projectile hit the aft deck at 10:16 and 32 seconds. The explosion was muffled, distant, like a hammer striking the hull from outside. Then nothing. No secondary detonations. No sympathetic explosions from nearby projectiles. Just that single, terrible thump. Then silence. For 3 seconds, Müller thought they'd survived. 1 hit, but no breach. The pressure hull had held. Then the lights went out. and the water started coming in. The emergency lighting flickered on 3 seconds after the main power died. Red bulbs cast the control room in crimson shadow. The flooding alarm screamed. Müller could hear it before anyone reported it. Water rushing into the aft compartment. Not a trickle, not a leak, a torrent. 400 gallons per minute pouring through a hole the size of a man's fist. The damage control officer's voice was steady despite the terror in his eyes. Breach in the aft battery compartment, Herr Kaleun. 3-inch hole in the pressure hull. We're attempting to seal it. Müller knew immediately that sealing was impossible. At 150 meters, the water pressure was too great. Any patch would be blown off the moment they applied it. The only option was to surface, and hope Starling didn't shell them before they could abandon ship. Emergency blow. All ballast tanks. Surface. The diving officer pulled the emergency. Blow levers. Compressed air screamed into the ballast tanks, forcing water out through the vents. The boat began to rise. But slowly. Too slowly. The flooding in the aft compartment was adding weight faster than the compressed air could expel ballast water. They were rising at 10 meters per minute. It would take 15 minutes to reach the surface. They didn't have 15 minutes. The temperature in the aft compartment was already climbing. Water pouring in at 200 pounds per square inch compressed the air inside the sealed space. Compressed air heats up. Physics. Within 2 minutes, the temperature in that compartment reached 150 degrees Celsius. Any man still alive in there was being cooked, their lungs seared by superheated air, their skin blistering. Müller could hear them screaming over the intercom before the circuit went dead. U-554 broke surface at 10:23, 11 minutes after the Hedgehog hit. The conning tower hatch burst, open, and Müller climbed out into cold Atlantic air. Starling was waiting. She'd maintained sonar contact throughout the ascent and positioned herself 800 meters off the starboard beam. Her deck gun was already trained on the U-boat. Müller gave the only order he could. Abandon ship. All hands. The crew evacuated in controlled panic. Men poured out of the forward hatch and the conning tower, grabbing life vests, inflating the rubber raft. The aft hatch never opened. The men in that compartment were already dead. Müller counted heads. 47 men made it out. 8 didn't. The boat was settling fast, stern first, flooding, pulling it down. Starling didn't fire. Instead, she manoeuvred closer and began pulling survivors from the water. Standard procedure by March 1944. The British wanted prisoners, wanted intelligence, wanted to know what the Germans knew about the convoy routes and patrol patterns. Müller found himself on Starling's deck 20 minutes later, wrapped in a blanket, watching his boat disappear beneath the waves. U-554 went down stern first at 10:57, carrying 8 dead crewmen and all the secrets of her final patrol. In the destroyer's wardroom, a British intelligence officer questioned Müller through an interpreter. The officer wanted to know about German tactics, about radio procedures, about Wolfpack coordination. Müller answered some questions, deflected others, gave the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. But eventually, the officer asked the question Müller had been dreading. How many Hedgehog attacks did you survive before we got you? Müller met his eyes. 4. The officer nodded, wrote something in his notebook. You lasted longer than most. Average is 2 patterns, sometimes 3. But nobody survives 4. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Your tactics were good, going deep, changing course. But the weapon doesn't care about your tactics. It only cares about geometry. 24 projectiles in a pattern 40 meters wide. Your boat is 76 meters long. If any part of that pattern overlaps with any part of your hull, you die. Simple mathematics. Müller said nothing. What could he say? The man was right. It was mathematics. Probability. Statistics. And the statistics were clear. The more Hedgehog attacks you survived, the higher the chance that the next one would kill you. It wasn't about skill or courage or experience. It was about rolling dice over and over until you lost. The intelligence officer leaned forward. "We're sinking a U-boat every 3 days now, most of them to Hedgehog. Your headquarters knows this. They're not telling your crews because they don't want panic. But you should know, you're going to a prisoner camp in Canada. You'll survive the war. Most of your comrades won't." What the British officer didn't tell Muller was the larger picture. The statistical nightmare that was unfolding across the entire Atlantic. Between March 1st and May 31st, 1944, Allied escorts equipped with Hedgehog would sink 24 U-boats in 90 days. 24 boats, nearly 1,200 men, one U-boat sinking every 3.7 days. The rate was accelerating. In March, 6 U-boats were sunk by Hedgehog. In April, 9. In May, another 9. The weapon that had been dismissed as ineffective in 1942 had become the primary submarine killer of 1944. The mathematics were brutal. British records showed that during the entire war, depth charges achieved a kill ratio of 60 to 1. For every 60 depth charge attacks, one U-boat was destroyed. Hedgehog achieved a ratio of 5.7 to 1. For every 6 Hedgehog attacks, one U-boat was killed. The improvement was more than tenfold, and as crews gained experience, the ratio improved further. By mid-1944, the US Navy was reporting an 8% kill rate per Hedgehog pattern. By mid-1945, that would climb to 10%. 1 in 10 attacks resulted in a kill. For U-boat crews, the implications were terrifying. A single Atlantic patrol might involve 5 or 6 encounters with escort vessels. If each encounter involved 2 or 3 Hedgehog attacks, the cumulative probability of death became almost certain. The mathematics were inescapable. Patrol after patrol, attack after attack, the odds ground down even the most experienced crews. Survival became a matter of luck, not skill. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Luth commanded U-181. He was one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders, second highest scoring ace in the Kriegsmarine, 46 confirmed sinkings, Knight's Cross with oak leaves and diamonds. He'd survived 4 years of war, dozens of depth charge attacks, multiple convoy battles. But in April 1944, Luth encountered Hedgehog for the first time and barely escaped. His patrol report, recovered after the war, described the experience in clinical detail. April 7th, 1944. Submerged at periscope depth, stalking convoy HX-285, detected by escort vessel, identified as destroyer class, dove to 200 meters. Heard multiple splashes forward of our position, counted 24 projectiles entering water. No explosions. Projectiles sank past our depth without detonating. Maintained course, assuming depth charges were set incorrectly. Second attack came 3 minutes later. Pattern landed closer. Still no explosions. Third attack landed directly overhead. One projectile struck forward deck but failed to detonate. Damage to outer hull plating only. Pressure hull intact. Surfaced after escort departed. Inspected damage. Found impact crater on deck. No penetration. Hedgehog projectile that hit his boat struck at a shallow angle and failed to penetrate the pressure hull. Contact-fuzes were designed to detonate on hard impact, but occasionally they malfunctioned. Projectiles that struck at glancing angles sometimes bounced off rather than detonating. But Luth understood what he'd survived. His report continued. This weapon is fundamentally different from depth charges. No warning of attack. No explosions unless direct hit achieved. Crew morale severely affected. They understand that depth charges can be evaded. This weapon cannot. If the pattern lands on you, you die. If it misses, you live. There is no skill involved, only chance. Luth's assessment circulated through the U-boat command structure. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, read it personally. Dönitz had been dismissing Hedgehog reports for months, believing they were exaggerations or misidentifications of conventional weapons. But Luth was not a man given exaggeration. If Luth said the weapon was deadly, it was deadly. Dönitz ordered intelligence officers to compile all available information on Hedgehog. The results were fragmentary. Prisoner interrogations provided some details. Survivors described the weapon's appearance, the pattern of projectiles, the lack of explosions on misses. But nobody could explain why it was suddenly so effective. The weapon had existed since late 1942. Why was it only now becoming a major threat? The answer lay in training and doctrine. When Hedgehog first entered service in November 1942, British crews didn't trust it. The weapon was new, unfamiliar, complicated to operate. Crews preferred depth charges because they were familiar and because the explosions gave psychological reassurance. Even when depth charges missed, the booming detonations felt like you were doing something. Hedgehog's silence when it missed felt like failure. A directive had been issued in early 1943 ordering commanders to report why they hadn't used Hedgehog on submarine contacts. The results revealed widespread reluctance. Crews complained about mechanical failures, about the weapon's limited range, about the difficulty of maintaining sonar contact during attacks. But the real issue was confidence. Crews didn't believe Hedgehog would work, so they didn't use it aggressively. That changed after an officer from the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development visited the escort base at Londonderry in late 1943. He brought examples of successful Hedgehog attacks, gun camera footage, sonar recordings, prisoner testimony. He conducted ship-wide briefings explaining the weapon's advantages: no blind spot, no lost sonar contact, faster sink rate than depth charges, contact fuzzes that guaranteed kills on hits. The briefings worked. Crews began using Hedgehog regularly, and as they gained experience, their accuracy improved. By January 1944, Hedgehog was the primary anti-submarine weapon on British escorts. By March, the kill rate had climbed to 15%. By May, it was approaching 20%. The weapon hadn't changed. The crews had. Training, confidence, and integration with improved sonar systems had transformed Hedgehog from an experimental curiosity into the most lethal submarine killer in the Atlantic. German intelligence officers couldn't figure this out from prisoner interrogations. All they knew was that U-boats were dying at unprecedented rates. In March 1944 alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 15 U-boats in the Atlantic, 6 to Hedgehog, 3 to aircraft, 4 to depth charges, 2 to unknown causes. In April, losses climbed to 21 boats, 9 to Hedgehog, 5 to aircraft, 7 to other causes. The U-boat fleet was hemorrhaging crews faster than training schools could replace them. The psychological effect on U-boat crews was catastrophic. Men who had survived multiple patrols began refusing to go to sea. Some claimed illness, others fabricated mechanical problems with their boats. A few deserted outright. The Kriegsmarine responded with courts-martial and executions, but that only made morale worse. By May 1944, it took threats of execution to get some crews aboard their boats. Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt commanded U-214. On his fourth patrol, in late April 1944, he encountered Hedgehog 3 times in a single day. The first attack missed. The second landed close enough that Schmidt could hear projectiles striking the seabed near his boat. The third attack hit. One projectile penetrated the forward torpedo room, flooding the compartment and killing 6 men instantly. Schmidt surfaced and surrendered. His crew was rescued by HMS Lochkillen. In his interrogation, Schmidt was asked how he felt knowing he'd survived when his crewmates had died. Schmidt's response was recorded verbatim. "I felt nothing. Relief, perhaps, but mostly nothing. We knew the weapon would get us eventually. It was only a question of when. Every time we heard those projectiles hit the water, every man aboard was calculating probabilities. 24 bombs, 40-meter pattern, 76-meter boat. If you're inside the pattern, 1 or 2 hits will kill you. We survived 2 attacks by luck. The 3rd attack. Luck ran out. Mathematics doesn't care about skill or courage. It only cares about numbers. The interrogator pressed him. Did you try to evade? Schmidt laughed bitterly. Of course we tried. Everyone tries. Go deep. Change course. Zigzag. It doesn't matter. The weapon descends at 7 meters per second. From the surface to 200 meters depth takes 28 seconds. In that time, we can turn maybe 30 degrees and move 50 meters. The projectiles land in a 40-meter circle. If we're anywhere near that circle when they land, we die. You can't evade something that fast. You can only hope it misses. By May 1944. German naval headquarters was receiving reports that described Hedgehog not as a weapon, but as a lottery of death. U-boat commanders spoke about it in almost superstitious terms. The weapon that strikes without warning. The silent killer. Der Totenbringer. The intelligence analysts tried to remain clinical. They compiled statistics, analyzed attack patterns, issued tactical recommendations. Go deeper than 400 meters if possible. Maintain speed to reduce time in the kill zone. Surface immediately if hit to minimize flooding. But everyone knew the recommendations were meaningless. You couldn't outrun mathematics. The final blow came in late May. U-549, a Type IXC boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Detlev Krankenhagen, departed Lorient on May 14th for a patrol in the South Atlantic. The boat was equipped with a schnorchel, the new breathing apparatus that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged. The schnorchel was supposed to make U-boats nearly invisible to radar and sonar. It was the latest German countermeasure, the technology that was supposed to turn the tide back in favor of the U-boats. On May 29th, U-549 encountered Task Group 21.11 off the Cape Verde Islands. The group consisted of the escort carrier USS Block Island and 4 destroyer escorts, including USS Eugene E. Elmore. Krankenhagen maneuvered into attack position and torpedoed Block Island, sinking her. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment, proof that U-boats could still strike effectively. Instead, it became a death sentence. Elmore hunted U-549 for the next 3 hours. The destroyer escort was equipped with Type 144 sonar, the most advanced system in the US Navy. Range 2,500 yards in normal conditions, 3,000 in ideal conditions. Elmore's sonar operator locked onto U-549 at 1,800 yards and never lost contact. Krankenhagen tried everything. Went deep to 600 feet, changed course repeatedly, ran silent. Nothing worked. The Type 144 sonar held them. At 14:30 hours, Elmore fired her first Hedgehog pattern. The projectiles missed. Krankenhagen tried to turn away, but Elmore maintained contact and reloaded. 3 minutes later, the second pattern entered the water. This time, sonar operators on Elmore heard 3 distinct underwater explosions 30 seconds after launch. 3 projectiles had struck U-549. The submarine imploded 4 minutes later at crush depth, killing all 59 crewmen aboard. Elmore's attack report described the engagement in technical language. Contact maintained throughout attack sequence. First pattern failed to achieve hits. Second pattern resulted in 3 confirmed detonations at target depth. Heavy crushing sound heard 4 minutes after detonation, consistent with pressure hull failure at depth. Contact lost. Target assessed as destroyed. The report was filed, analysed, and added to the growing pile of evidence that Hedgehog was ending the U-boat threat. By the end of May 1944, the statistics were undeniable. In 3 months, Hedgehog had sunk 24 U-boats, more than aircraft, more than depth charges, more than any other single weapon system. The average depth charge attack required 60 attempts to achieve 1 kill. The average Hedgehog attack required fewer than 6. The The weapon had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a brutal stalemate into a systematic execution of the U-boat fleet. German naval headquarters tried to respond. They issued new tactical directives: avoid convoy routes where Hedgehog-equipped escorts were known to operate. Surface immediately if detected to deny the weapon its underwater advantage. Maintain depth below 400 meters to reduce effectiveness. But the directives were meaningless. By mid-1944, most Allied escorts carried Hedgehog. Surfacing meant facing deck guns and aircraft. Going below 400 meters meant operating near crush depth with minimal reserve for evasion. The truth was that there was no effective countermeasure to Hedgehog. The weapon exploited the fundamental vulnerability of submarines, their need to operate underwater, where detection meant death. Once an escort achieved sonar contact and maintained it during the attack run, the U-boat had no options. It couldn't outrun the projectiles. It couldn't dodge them. It could only hope the pattern missed. And hope was not a tactic. By June 1944, U-boat losses had reached the point where Admiral Dönitz considered withdrawing all boats from the Atlantic. The loss rate had climbed to 75%. 3 out of every 4 U-boats that departed on patrol never returned. Those odds were unsustainable. Crews were being sent to their deaths with no reasonable expectation of success. The U-boat campaign, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1942, had become a suicide mission by 1944. Dönitz kept the boats at sea only because Hitler ordered it. The Führer insisted that U-boats, even if they sank no ships, tied down Allied resources. Every escort hunting U-boats was an escort not supporting the invasion of Europe. It was a strategic argument, but it ignored the human cost. Every U-boat sent to sea was 40 to 50 men sent to die for no tactical gain. The crews knew it, the commanders knew it, even Dönitz knew it. But the orders stood. In July 1944, U-233 departed Bergen, Norway, for a patrol in the North Atlantic. The boat was commanded by Kapitänleutnant Hans-Joachim Bertelsmann, an experienced officer with 3 previous patrols. The crew was mostly veterans. They knew what they were facing. Before departure, Bertelsmann addressed his men in the mess deck. His words were recorded by a crew member who survived the war in a prisoner camp. "Gentlemen, we know the situation. The Atlantic is no longer our ocean. The enemy has weapons we cannot defeat. They have aircraft that see through darkness. They have sonar that tracks us at depths we once thought safe. And they have Hedgehog. I will not lie to you. If we encounter Hedgehog, our chances of survival are poor. 1 in 5 attacks results in a kill. If we face multiple attacks, the odds compound against us. Mathematics is not on our side." He paused, let the words sink in, then continued. "But we are still U-boat men. We still have our training, our discipline, our courage. We will execute our mission professionally. We will hunt enemy shipping. And if we encounter Hedgehog, we will do everything possible to survive. That is all we can do. That is all any of us can do." 233 was sunk by Hedgehog on July 26, 1944, by the British frigate HMS Curzon. All hands lost. Bertelsmann's speech became legend among surviving U-boat crews after the war, not because it offered hope, but because it acknowledged the truth. They were fighting a weapon they couldn't defeat. The only question was whether they would be among the 20% who died or the 80% who survived each attack. The war ended in May 1945. By then, Hedgehog had sunk 47 U-boats confirmed, with another dozen probable. The weapon had achieved what depth charges never could: systematic destruction of submarines through precision rather than brute force. The statistics told the story. 5,174 depth charge attacks for 85 kills, 268 Hedgehog attacks for 47 kills. One weapon required 60 attacks per kill. The other required fewer than 6. In 1946, Allied naval officers met with surviving U-boat commanders at interrogation centres across Europe. They wanted to understand the German perspective, to learn what had worked and what hadn't. One question appeared repeatedly in the transcripts. What was the most effective Allied anti-submarine weapon? The answers were unanimous. Not aircraft, though aircraft killed many boats. Not depth charges, though they terrified crews. Hedgehog. Every surviving commander cited Hedgehog as the weapon they feared most, not because it was the most powerful, but because it was the most certain. One hit, or two, was usually fatal, and there was no way to know if an attack had missed until it was over. The silence was worse than explosions, because silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant fear. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Müller, who survived U-554's sinking and spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner camp, was interviewed in 1947 by U.S. Navy historians. They asked him what made Hedgehog so effective. Müller's answer was recorded verbatim. The weapon removed skill from the equation. A depth charge attack was a duel between the escort commander and the U-boat captain. Both men used tactics, experience, intuition. The better tactician usually won, but Hedgehog was not a duel. It was an execution. The escort maintained sonar contact. They fired the weapon. It either hit or it missed. We had no influence over the outcome. That was psychologically devastating. We were trained to believe that skill and courage mattered. Hedgehog proved they didn't. Only luck mattered. And luck always runs out eventually. He paused, remembering the morning his luck ran out. Then continued, I survived because I was fortunate. 47 of my crew survived. 8 did not. Those 8 men died because mathematics said they would, not because they were less skilled or less brave, just because the pattern landed on them. In war, we accept that brave men die, but we want to believe their deaths have meaning, that they died fighting, using their skills to the end. Hedgehog denied us even that. It reduced brave men to statistics. That was the cruelty of it. Not the weapon itself, but what it represented. The industrialization of death, the removal of the human element. We were not warriors anymore, just targets in a probability calculation. The British officer who designed Hedgehog, Commander Charles Goodeve of the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, was asked after the war if he felt any remorse for creating such an effective killing machine. His response was clinical. War is mathematics. The side that applies mathematics most effectively wins. Hedgehog was simply the logical application of probability theory to submarine warfare. 24 projectiles in a pattern large enough to overlap a submarine's hull, high sink rate to minimize evasion time, contact fuses to guarantee kills on hits. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. Efficient. That was the word that captured the essence of Hedgehog. The weapon was efficient. It killed submarines efficiently. It used minimal explosives efficiently. It allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact efficiently. Efficiency won wars, but efficiency also meant that 1,200 German submariners died not in heroic battles, but in mathematical certainty. They died because a pattern of bombs happened to land on them rather than beside them. They died because probability said they would. Decades after the war, historians would debate Hedgehog's role in ending the U-boat threat. Some argued aircraft were more important. Others credited improved radar and sonar. But the submariners themselves, the men who survived, they had no doubt. Hedgehog broke the U-boat fleet not by killing the most boats, but by destroying crew morale. It made every patrol a lottery with death. And men can fight enemies. They can fight weapons. But they cannot fight mathematics. Mathematics always wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. On the morning of February 20th, 1943, Lieutenant Don Story and his crew aboard the B-24D Liberator, nicknamed Blonde Bomber II, lifted off from their base in North Africa. Their target was Naples. The mission was routine, one of hundreds being flown as the Allied bombing campaign slowly tightened its grip around Fortress Europe. But routine missions in 1943 had a way of becoming catastrophic without warning. The B-24D they flew that morning represented the first true mass-production variant of the Liberator family. It weighed nearly 60,000 pounds at takeoff, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R183043 twin Wasp engines, each generating 1,200 horsepower through turbo superchargers that allowed the bomber to operate effectively at 25,000 feet. The aircraft carried a crew of 10 men, each with a specific role in the complex choreography of high-altitude bombing. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the well-glazed cockpit. The bombardier and navigator occupied the greenhouse nose, surrounded by dozens of plexiglass panels that offered excellent visibility, but no protection. The radio operator sat behind the pilots. The flight engineer manned the dorsal turret, and the gunners, 4 of them, distributed themselves throughout the fuselage in positions that would soon become legendary for their lethal effectiveness. Over the target, German flak batteries opened fire with methodical precision. The sky filled with black puffs of explosive fury, each one capable of tearing a bomber apart. Blonde Bomber II took several direct hits. The massive aircraft shuddered as shrapnel ripped through aluminum skin. One engine died, then another. Fuel streamed from punctured tanks. The hydraulic systems failed. Lieutenant Story fought the controls as the crippled bomber began losing altitude. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Story's options narrowed with every passing second. Malta was too far. North Africa was impossible. The Mediterranean stretched below them, cold and unforgiving. Then, through the smoke and confusion, Story spotted an airfield on the southern tip of Sicily. Pacino. What he did not know, what he could not have known in that moment of desperate calculation, was that Pacino was in enemy hands. The airfield was Italian. The B-24 came down hard, wheels up, sliding across the dirt runway in a storm of dust and torn metal. When the bomber finally ground to a halt, Story and his 9-man crew scrambled out, hands raised. Their war was over. But for the Axis powers, a far more significant war had just begun. Within hours, Italian soldiers and Regia Aeronautica ground crews swarmed the downed aircraft. What they found was extraordinary. Unlike the wreckage typically recovered from crashed bombers, Blonde Bomber II was nearly intact. The fuselage was scarred with flak damage, the engines were wrecked, and the landing had torn away much of the undercarriage. But the aircraft's fundamental structure, its weapons systems, and most critically, its design philosophy, were all available for study. The Italians understood immediately what they had. This was not simply another bomber. This was the first complete B-24 Liberator to fall into Axis hands. It was an intelligence windfall beyond measure. Italian engineers began their examination within days. They photographed every system, documented every component, and meticulously measured every dimension. They studied the innovative Davis wing, noting its unusual high aspect ratio and thin profile. They examined the twin bomb bay configuration, each bay capable of holding the same bomb load as a B-17 single bay. They analyzed the complex arrangement of defensive turrets, the self-sealing fuel tanks, and the oxygen distribution system. They measured the skin of thickness, documented the rivet patterns, and studied the electrical systems. But what truly captured their attention, what sent chills through the spines of Italian Air Force Command, was the sheer volume of defensive firepower this single aircraft could bring to bear. 10 Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns. 10. To put this in perspective, a typical Italian bomber of the period, the Piaggio P-108, carried perhaps 4 or 5 machine guns of various calibers for defense. The German Heinkel He 111, one of the Luftwaffe's primary bombers, mounted up to 7 machine guns, most of them the lighter 7.92mm caliber. The B-24 carried 10 weapons, all of them 50 caliber, all of them positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Each weapon capable of firing 850 rounds per minute, each round carrying 3 times the kinetic energy of standard rifle caliber ammunition. each gun positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that covered nearly every angle of attack. The mathematics were staggering. In sustained fire, a single B-24 could throw 140 heavy machine gun bullets into the surrounding airspace every second. The Italian test pilots who flew Blonde Bomber II during its brief stay at Guidonia reported that the aircraft handled well, surprisingly docile for such a large machine, but they also recognized the limitations of their testing program. Italy lacked the sophisticated facilities, the instrumentation, and frankly, the technical expertise to fully exploit this intelligence prize. The bomber needed to be evaluated in combat scenarios, tested against fighters, analyzed by pilots who understood the evolving dynamics of the air war over Europe. But the Italians also recognized that they lacked the technical infrastructure and testing facilities to fully exploit this prize. The Germans, however, did not, and the Germans wanted this bomber. The Italians, reluctant to surrender such a valuable prize, eventually yielded to German pressure. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean was deteriorating. Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of Sicily. Italian cities were being bombed with increasing frequency and intensity. The Guidonia facility itself had become dangerously exposed to Allied air raids. Better to send the captured bomber to Germany, where it could be properly evaluated, than risk losing it to an Allied bombing raid. On June 19, 1943, Captain Giovanni Reina climbed into the cockpit of Blonde Bomber II for what would be its final flight under Italian control. The aircraft had been given a temporary Italian civil registration, I-Reine, in Reina's honor. With 2 Italian mechanics aboard, Reina flew the captured B-24 north to Munich and then on to Rechlin, where it would join another captured American heavy bomber already undergoing evaluation, a B-17 Flying Fortress that had been shot down over the Netherlands months earlier. The Germans immediately understood what the Italians had discovered. This aircraft represented not merely a tactical challenge, but a strategic catastrophe. The B-24 Liberator had been designed in 1938 as Consolidated Aircraft's answer to a United States Army Air Corps request for a heavy bomber superior to the Boeing B-17. But where Boeing had created a robust, high-altitude fortress built on traditional aerodynamic principles, Consolidated had pursued a radical new approach centered on a revolutionary wing design. The Davis wing was the heart of the B-24's performance. Developed by engineer David R. Davis through unconventional means involving precise measurements of airflow patterns, the wing featured a high aspect ratio with a thin, laminar flow profile. It was long and slender, stretching 110 feet from tip to tip, yet featuring 25% less surface area than the B-17's wing. The result was an aircraft with exceptional range, high cruise, speed, and the ability to carry massive bomb loads over distances no other American bomber could match. The wing's efficiency was remarkable. At cruising altitude, the Davis wing generated lift with minimal drag, allowing the B-24 to achieve a range of nearly 3,000 miles with a moderate bomb load. This range advantage made the Liberator invaluable for operations in the Pacific Theater, where vast ocean distances separated bases from targets. It also made the B-24 essential for anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic, where the aircraft could patrol areas previously beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. On paper, the Davis wing was brilliant. In practice, it was a calculated trade-off. The wing's efficiency came at a terrible cost. It was thin, structurally delicate, and catastrophically vulnerable to battle damage. Where a B-17's robust wing could absorb cannon fire and continue flying, the B-24's Davis wing, when struck by heavy-caliber weapons, had a tendency to fail completely. The wing would simply snap off. Pilots quickly learned that the Davis wing would not hold enough ice to chill your drink, and it certainly would not hold enough battle damage to bring you home. German fighter pilots who engaged B-24 seconds in combat reported that successful hits on the wing often resulted in catastrophic structural failure. The thin wing skin offered minimal resistance to 20mm or 30mm cannon shells. A burst that might merely damage a B-17's wing could cause a B-24's wing to fold, break, or separate entirely from the fuselage. This vulnerability earned the B-24 an unfortunate reputation among American crews, many of whom would have preferred to fly the more robust B-17. The Luftwaffe engineers at Rechlin documented all of this with clinical precision. They measured the wing's dimensions, analyzed its construction, and calculated its load-bearing capacity. They noted the innovative tricycle landing gear, an unusual feature for the time, that positioned the aircraft level on the ground and eliminated the tail-dragging stance common to most contemporary aircraft. They examined the twin bomb bay configuration, noting how the roller-type doors retracted along the fuselage sides, rather than opening downward like conventional bomb bay doors. They studied the shoulder-mounted wing design that provided exceptional ground clearance but made ditching nearly impossible. But the technical analysis, comprehensive as it was, represented only half of the intelligence value. The true revelation would come from flight testing. For 3 months, Blonde Bomber II sat in a hangar at Rechlin, while German specialists conducted their exhaustive ground examination. They replaced damaged components with salvaged American parts recovered from other downed bombers. They jury-rigged German instruments into the American control panels, installing German altimeters and radio equipment alongside the original American gauges. They studied the self-sealing fuel tanks, a technology the Germans had developed but failed to implement as widely as the Americans. They examined the oxygen distribution system that enabled high-altitude flight, noting its redundancy and reliability. Every system, every component, every design choice revealed the same underlying philosophy. The Americans were not building bombers for elegance or individual craftsmanship. They were building bombers for mass production and overwhelming numerical superiority. And then came the day when Captain Werner Lerche was ordered to fly it. Lerche was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, a man who would eventually fly over 125 different captured aircraft types during the war. He had flown captured British Spitfires and American P-51 Mustangs. He had evaluated Soviet fighters and French bombers. But the B-24 would prove different. This aircraft would not merely test his skills as a pilot, it would force him to confront the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat. There was no instruction manual. There were no training programs. No American pilot had defected to provide guidance. Lerche had to learn the B-24 through observation and experimentation, assisted by the 2 Italian mechanics who had accompanied the aircraft from Sicily and who had observed Captain Rayner's techniques during the ferry flight. He studied the cockpit layout, familiarizing himself with the American instrument panel and control arrangement. He memorized the engine start procedures, learning the proper sequence for priming the fuel-injected Pratt & Whitney engines. He familiarized himself with the complex turbo-supercharger controls, understanding how to manage boost pressure at different altitudes. The first flight was scheduled for late summer, 1943. Ground crews towed the repainted bomber to the runway. Gone were the American stars and bars. In their place, black Luftwaffe crosses marked the wings and fuselage. A swastika adorned the tail. The blonde pin-up girl had been painted over with dark green camouflage, obliterated beneath thick coats of German paint. Blonde Bomber II had become a tool of German intelligence, its American identity erased, its new purpose purely analytical. Lerche advanced the throttles. The 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1000 830 twin Wasp engines roared to life, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The massive bomber, weighing nearly 60,000 pounds fully loaded, began its takeoff roll. The tricycle landing gear allowed for a shorter takeoff distance than conventional tail draggers, and Lerche noted how the nose wheel provided better visibility during ground operations. He could see the runway ahead clearly, unlike tailwheel aircraft where the nose-up attitude during taxi obscured forward vision. The B-24 lifted off smoothly. Lerche was immediately struck by the aircraft's docile handling characteristics. Unlike many heavy bombers, which required constant attention and muscle to keep in trim, the Liberator flew with surprising ease. The controls were well balanced, responsive without being overly sensitive. The engines ran smoothly, their sound a deep, steady rumble rather than the harsh rasp of some German radial engines. The aircraft exhibited good stability in all axes, requiring minimal input to maintain level flight. But it was during simulated combat maneuvers that Lerche began to understand the true nature of what he was flying. He deliberately shut down 2 engines on one side, simulating catastrophic battle damage of the sort that would typically send a bomber into an uncontrollable spin. The B-24 continued flying. It handled sluggishly, certainly, banking slightly toward the dead engines, but it remained controllable. With careful attention to rudder trim and power management on the operating engines, Lerche found he could maintain altitude and even execute gentle turns. This explained the American bomber's legendary ability to absorb damage and limp home. The aircraft had been designed from the beginning with redundancy and survivability in mind. Lerche conducted multiple test flights over the following weeks. He explored the B-24's flight envelope, testing its stall characteristics at various configurations and weights. He evaluated its formation flying qualities, noting how the aircraft maintained position with reasonable ease despite its size. He assessed its vulnerability to various attack profiles, flying defensive maneuvers while German fighter pilots in Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds simulated attacks. But the most devastating findings would come not from Lerche's piloting, but from the defensive armament tests. The Luftwaffe established a comprehensive evaluation program. German fighter pilots flew simulated attacks against the captured B-24, while camera aircraft filmed the engagements from multiple angles. The goal was to develop tactics that would allow Luftwaffe fighters to effectively engage the American bomber formations that were beginning to appear over German skies in ever-increasing numbers. Ground-based observers tracked the engagements, noting approach angles, closure rates, firing windows, and breakaway points. What they discovered was a nightmare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The B-24's defensive armament represented a quantum leap in bomber protection. The aircraft mounted 10 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns distributed across 4 powered turrets and 2 waist gun positions. But it was not merely the number of guns that made the B-24 so formidable. It was their positioning, their fields of fire, and the devastating effectiveness of the 50 caliber cartridge itself. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was not a defensive weapon in the traditional sense. It was a purpose-built killing machine. Each round measured 5.5 inches long and weighed approximately 1.8 ounces. The cartridge contained a precisely measured powder charge that, when ignited, accelerated the bullet to 2,900 feet per second as it left the barrel. At that velocity, the bullet carried enormous kinetic energy, nearly 13,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle, more than 3 times the energy of the standard German 7.92 mm rifle round, and significantly more than even the German 13 mm heavy machine gun. At ranges exceeding 600 yards, distances where lighter caliber weapons lost effectiveness, a single 50 caliber round could penetrate armor plate, destroy engines, shatter cockpit canopies, and kill pilots. The bullet's trajectory remained relatively flat at combat ranges, making accurate shooting more achievable. The weapon's rate of fire, 850 rounds per minute in practice, meant that even short bursts placed multiple rounds on target, and the B-24 carried 10 or of them. The nose turret, introduced on the B-24H variant, housed 2 50 caliber guns in an Emerson A-15 powered turret. This turret could traverse 180 degrees horizontally and elevate through a wide arc, covering the entire forward hemisphere and eliminating the vulnerability to frontal attacks that had plagued earlier B-24D models, like Blonde Bomber II. The bombardier controlled this turret through a computing gun sight that automatically calculated lead angles based on target range and relative motion. When German fighters attempted head-on attacks, they faced 2 50 caliber guns, firing directly into their approach path. The dorsal turret, mounted just aft of the cockpit on a slightly raised position, provided coverage of the upper hemisphere with 2 more 50 caliber guns. The flight engineer typically manned this position, giving him a panoramic view of approaching fighters while maintaining line of sight to his instruments and engine gauges. The turret could rotate 360 degrees and had sufficient elevation to engage fighters approaching from almost any angle above the horizontal plane. And finally, 2 waist gunners, positioned in staggered locations along the fuselage sides rather than directly across from each other, added 4 more 50 caliber guns to cover beam attacks from either side. The staggered positioning allowed the gunners to move without interfering with each other, a lesson learned from earlier combat experience where waist gunners positioned directly opposite each other would collide when swinging their weapons. The Luftwaffe test pilots at Rechlin conducted countless simulated attack runs in Bf 109 seconds and Fw 190 seconds against the captured B-24. Combat cameramen filmed every engagement from chase planes. The results were analyzed frame by frame, quantified, and compiled into tactical reports that would be distributed to every fighter squadron on the Western Front. The conclusions were unanimous and devastating. Rear attacks, the traditional German approach dating back to the early days of air combat, exposed the attacking fighter to at least 4 heavy machine guns, concentrating fire along a predictable intercept path. The tail gunner and the dorsal turret gunner could both engage targets approaching from 6 o'clock, and depending on the angle, one or both waist gunners might also bring their weapons to bear. The closing speed of approximately 150 to 200 miles per hour differential gave the German pilot perhaps 3 to 5 seconds to fire before breaking away to avoid collision with the bomber's massive tail assembly. During those 3 to 5 seconds, the B-24's gunners poured hundreds of 50 caliber rounds into the air, creating a cone of fire the fighter had to penetrate. The visual and psychological impact was overwhelming, forcing pilots to break off attacks prematurely long before reaching optimal firing range. Attacks from below offered no better prospects. The Sperry ball turret eliminated all blind spots in the lower hemisphere. Its computing gun sight gave even moderately skilled gunners a significant advantage. German pilots discovered that attacking from beneath a B-24 formation meant exposing themselves to concentrated fire from multiple ball turrets, each tracking their approach with mechanical precision. The tracers created patterns in the sky, beautiful and terrible, streams of light converging on the attacking fighter. Most pilots broke off these attacks after the first pass, shaken by the volume of fire directed at them. Side attacks faced the staggered waist gunners and the dorsal turret, creating zones where a single attacking fighter could be simultaneously engaged by up to 4 different machine guns. The German test pilots noted that beam attacks required perfect timing and positioning to minimize exposure time in the kill zone. Enter too early, and you gave the gunners too much time to track you. Enter too late, and you might not have time to aim effectively before flashing past the target. But with the introduction of the nose turret on the B-24H model that began entering service in mid-1943, even this approach became exponentially more dangerous. Now, frontal attackers faced not 1 or 2 handheld flexible guns, but a powered turret with 2 50 caliber weapons aimed by a computing gun sight. The frontal attack that had been the Luftwaffe's last tactical solution was being systematically eliminated by American engineering improvements. A fully engaged B-24 could deliver 160 heavy machine gun bullets into the surrounding airspace every second. When multiplied across a combat box formation of 27 aircraft flying in close defensive formation, the defensive fire represented over 270 heavy machine guns, creating an overlapping sphere of lethality. German pilots who survived attacks on these formations described it as flying into a steel curtain, a wall of tracers so dense that penetrating it seemed more a matter of divine intervention than tactical skill. The tactical lessons were clear. Attack from the front if you must attack at all. Use altitude advantage to dive through the formation at maximum speed, fire 1 burst, and escape before defensive fire concentrates on you. Never turn with a bomber formation. Never slow down within gun range. Never assume a damaged bomber is helpless, but they were also secondary to a far more crushing strategic reality. As the German engineers and intelligence officers completed their evaluation of Blonde Bomber II in the autumn of 1943, they were forced to confront a truth that extended far beyond tactics and armament. The B-24 was more than a bomber. It was physical evidence of American industrial supremacy operating at a scale Germany could never hope to match. The captured B-24's construction revealed a manufacturing philosophy fundamentally different from German practices. Where German aircraft were built by skilled craftsmen through time-consuming, labor-intensive processes that emphasized quality and precision, the B-24 had been designed from the beginning for mass production. Its components were standardized, meaning that parts from one aircraft would fit any other aircraft of the same model without hand-fitting or adjustment. They were interchangeable, a concept the automotive industry had perfected, but the aviation industry had been slow to adopt, and they were optimized for assembly line manufacturing, designed so that unskilled or semi-skilled workers could assemble them following clear instructions and using specialized jigs and fixtures. Sorensen returned to Detroit and sketched out a plan on hotel stationery in a single sleepless night. He envisioned a factory where aircraft moved and workers stayed in place, where specialized tools were positioned at each station, where parts flowed to assembly points in a carefully choreographed sequence. He would build B-24 seconds the way Ford built automobiles, on a moving assembly line with standardized components and precision machining. The result was Willow Run, a factory so vast that workers used bicycles to move between stations. The plant began operation in 1942, producing just one aircraft per month. It was a disaster. The skilled craftsmen from the aviation industry clashed with Ford's industrial engineers. The precision required for aircraft assembly seemed incompatible with automotive production techniques. Parts didn't fit. Tools broke. Workers made mistakes. Production fell far behind schedule. Critics mocked Henry Ford's ambition. Aviation industry executives sneered that you can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. The government seriously considered taking over the facility and installing new management. The cost reduction was achieved through learning curve effects, improved tooling, better material handling, and, most importantly, sheer volume. Fixed costs were spread across more units. Workers became more efficient through practice. Processes were continuously refined. Waste was systematically eliminated. The total B-24 production exceeded 18,482 aircraft by war's end. 18,000. More than any other military aircraft in American history. More than the entire German bomber fleet across all types combined. More than any single German aircraft type ever produced. By comparison, Germany's only operational four-engine heavy bomber, the troubled Heinkel He 177, suffered from chronic engine fires and mechanical problems. Total production across all variants barely exceeded 1,100 aircraft. The mathematics were undeniable. American industry was producing complex heavy bombers at a rate 5 to 10 times higher than Germany could manage. And this was just one aircraft type. Simultaneously, American factories were building thousands of B-17 seconds, P-51, Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, C-47 transports, and countless other aircraft. The industrial capacity gap wasn't closing, it was widening. On what would prove to be his fourth and final flight in Blonde Bomber II, Lerche experienced firsthand the B-24's most significant vulnerability. As he brought the massive bomber in for landing after a routine test flight, approaching the runway at approximately 130 miles per hour, the nose landing gear, weakened during the original crash landing in Sicily 6 months earlier, and inadequately repaired by German technicians working with improvised parts, collapsed on touchdown. The B-24's nose slammed into the runway with tremendous force. Sparks erupted as metal scraped concrete. The aircraft slid forward on its belly in a shower of grinding metal and torn aluminum before coming to rest several hundred yards down the runway. Lerche and his crew emerged shaken but uninjured, protected by the robust cockpit structure. The captured bomber, however, was done. The nose section was destroyed. The forward fuselage was bent. The structural damage extended back to the wing root. The Germans would later attempt to repair the aircraft, salvaging what components they could, but the fundamental damage was too severe. The B-24 would never fly again. The nose landing gear issue would prove to be a chronic problem with captured B-24 seconds. The tricycle configuration, while offering advantages during normal operations, made the aircraft particularly vulnerable to damage during rough landings or operations from unprepared fields. German attempts to operate captured B-24 seconds from grass fields often ended in landing gear failures. The B-17, with its conventional tail-wheel configuration, proved more forgiving of rough field operations, which was one reason KG-200 ultimately operated more captured B-17 seconds than B-24 seconds in their clandestine missions. But the intelligence value of Blonde Bomber II had already been extracted. The evaluation was complete. The tactical reports had been written, compiled, and distributed. The conclusions had been sent to every fighter squadron on the Western Front, to the fighter training schools, to the tactical development staff at Luftwaffe headquarters, and those conclusions offered no comfort whatsoever. But these operations were tactical curiosities, desperate attempts to exploit captured equipment in the face of overwhelming enemy superiority. They changed nothing. The strategic equation remained unchanged and unchangeable. By late 1944, the bomber streams over Germany had grown to 1,000 aircraft raids. B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds flew in massive formations that stretched across miles of sky, each combat box containing dozens of bombers flying in tight defensive formations. They were escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that had the range to accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back, fighters that could outperform most German aircraft and were flown by increasingly experienced pilots. The sanctuary that German fighters once enjoyed deep within the Reich had vanished, but none of it mattered. Germany could not overcome an enemy who could design, manufacture, and deploy 18,000 complex heavy bombers while simultaneously building over 300,000 other aircraft and 88,000 tanks. The industrial mathematics were insurmountable. The production gap wasn't narrowing. It was widening. Every month, American factories produced more aircraft than the month before. Every month, German production struggled to replace losses, while Allied bombing systematically destroyed the factories, the infrastructure, and the resource base that made production possible. The true lesson, delivered by the captured B-24 seconds, was not about tactics or armament or aerodynamics. It was about the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare. You cannot defeat an enemy who can build machines faster than you. It can destroy them. The B-24's defensive firepower was sufficient to make attacking them costly, dangerous, and often fatal. The 50 caliber weapons, the overlapping fields of fire, the powered turrets, all of these made the B-24 a formidable defensive platform. But that firepower alone did not win the air war. The defensive armament made the bombers survivable enough to accomplish their missions. But the air war was won by sheer overwhelming numbers, by the ability of American factories to produce bombers in quantities that simply could not be countered by any defensive measures Germany could muster. Enough bombers survived each raid to drop their bombs on target. Enough industrial facilities were destroyed to cripple German war production. Enough oil refineries were bombed to create crippling fuel shortages. Enough transportation hubs were destroyed to paralyze logistics. Enough factories were damaged to reduce aircraft production to a fraction of requirements. And in the final accounting, the captured B-24 Blonde Bomber II became an unwitting, silent witness to the defeat of its captors, demonstrating that in modern war, industrial power is the ultimate weapon. By 1945, the skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to a shell. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. The pilot training program had collapsed. Fuel stocks were depleted to the point where many aircraft sat grounded not from lack of planes but lack of fuel to fly them. Aircraft production had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing and resource shortages. The jet fighters and advanced weapons that German engineers were developing, revolutionary designs like the Me-262 and the Me-163 rocket interceptor came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Germany had built brilliant aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, nimble and deadly. The Focke-Wulf Fo 190, robust and powerful. The Junkers Ju 88, versatile and effective. Each was a masterpiece of engineering, built by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work, who measured twice and cut once, who hand-fitted components until everything worked perfectly. But masterpieces take time to build, and time was the one resource Germany did not have. The Americans built workhorses, functional, reliable, mass-produced machines designed not for elegance but for overwhelming numerical superiority. The B-24 was never as beloved as the B-17. Crews called it the flying coffin due to its vulnerability to battle damage. They complained about its difficult handling characteristics, particularly at high altitude. They noted how the Davis wing's tendency to fail catastrophically when struck by cannon fire earned it a reputation for fragility. Given a choice, most American aircrews preferred the B-17. But preferences do not matter when you are building an arsenal for total war. What matters is production capacity, delivery, schedules, and the ability to sustain losses while maintaining operational effectiveness. The B-24 excelled at all of these. It could be built quickly, in vast numbers, using standardized components and assembly line techniques perfected by the automotive industry. The B-24 did its job. It carried heavier bomb loads farther than the B-17. It served in every theater of the war. It sank U-boats in the Atlantic, closing the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had once operated with impunity. It bombed oil refineries in Ploesti in one of the war's most daring low-level attacks. It supported ground forces throughout the Pacific Island campaigns. It flew supplies over the Himalayas into China, along routes so dangerous they earned the nickname the Hump. It conducted maritime patrol missions, reconnaissance flights, and transport operations. And at the end of production in 1945, over 18,482 had been built, more than any other military aircraft in American history. The captured B-24 seconds gave the Luftwaffe every tactical insight they could possibly need. The evaluation reports from Rechlin documented the blind spots, though there were precious few. They identified the vulnerable systems, particularly the Davis wing. They detailed the optimal attack profiles. German fighter pilots knew exactly where to aim, exactly when to fire, exactly how to maximize their chances of survival while engaging these bombers. But knowledge without resources is meaningless. All the tactical intelligence in the world could not change the strategic reality. The tactics developed at Rechlin were sound. They gave German fighter pilots the best possible chance of success, but best possible was not good enough. The bomber formations kept coming. The production numbers kept climbing. The industrial advantage kept widening. No amount of tactical skill could overcome strategic industrial imbalance. The nose-wheel failure that ended Werner Lurch's flight in Blonde Bomber II was, in retrospect, a fitting metaphor for Germany's entire war effort. They had captured the enemy's weapon. They had studied it exhaustively, understanding its strengths and weaknesses with engineering precision. They had developed effective tactics. They had trained their pilots well. And still they lost, because the weapon itself was never the point. The weapon was merely the visible manifestation of an industrial system that Germany could never match, never counter, never overcome. When the war ended in May 1945, over 6,000 B-24 seconds sat in storage fields across the American Southwest, parked in neat rows stretching to the horizon, waiting to be scrapped. Their aluminum would be melted down and recast into civilian products, coffee percolators and cooking pots and automobile parts for a nation transitioning back to peace. The wartime emergency had passed. The bombers, so desperately needed just months before, were now obsolete. Newer aircraft, the B-29 Superfortress, and eventually the jet-powered B-47, would define the next generation of strategic bombing. Germany's aviation industry lay in ruins. The factories that had produced the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were destroyed, captured, or dismantled. The skilled workforce was dead, captured, scattered, or absorbed into rebuilding efforts. The infrastructure that supported aircraft production, the aluminum smelters, the engine factories, the instrument shops, had been systematically destroyed by years of strategic bombing. Germany would not build military aircraft again for decades. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.